welcome back to Reclaim You. We're chatting with Abby today. Hey, Abby.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, everyone.
Hey, so we are doing the who, why, how, what, all about boundaries today.
Yes,
Yeah.
boundaries.
Mm.
So hard, but like so necessary.
Right, but so important. And like eye
Yeah.
roll at the same time and
Mm.
all of the things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that
Yeah.
I just actually posted on Instagram a reel and from last week's episode with Casey talking about boundaries, and I was like, ugh. And that's kind of like the reaction that I feel like a lot of us give because boundaries are so hard.
Yeah. And we talk about boundaries all the time, and it feels like it's sort of, I mean, in my mind, I'm like, oh gosh, like I feel like I am constantly thinking about boundaries, talking about boundaries, and still, like, despite all the conversation about boundaries, like it's still so hard to put into
It's such a
practice.
challenge.
Yeah, why it's so important to keep talking about and to keep exploring, like, how are boundaries
Mhm.
um showing up in my life, not showing up in my life, where do I need
Uh-huh.
to set up more boundaries?
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess to start, can you, like, when you think about boundaries or talk about boundaries, what does it mean? Because we do, we talk about boundaries a lot. And sometimes I think it's helpful to break it down to like, what is a boundary?
Yeah, I being like more visual in my brain, I really think of boundaries as being sort of like the space between me and whatever else is in existence, like the
Uh-huh.
boundary between me and another person, the boundary between me and diet culture, for example. Prentice Hemphill, who, like, I'm gonna have to read the quote exactly, is a therapist, somatics teacher, founder of Embodiment Institute, has an amazing quote about
Mhm.
boundaries. They state, boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. And when
Oh.
I read that, heard that, it just solidified my understanding of boundaries in a different
Mhm.
way, like in a very embodied way. Like, it's the space
Mhm.
at which I can love you and me simultaneously. That definition also helped me come to terms with the fact that boundaries are not just important for me, but they're important for all of my relationships. I
Mm.
think it's so easy to get wrapped up in, like, when I set a boundary, I'm being selfish. It's all about me. This definition that they write about boundaries, this distance at which I can love you and me
Mm.
simultaneously, like, I think it's so important
Yeah.
to remember. Yeah, it's super relational. Boundaries are super relational.
Yeah. No, that is a really wonderful quote. And I'm curious how you just alluded to it some of like how do you feel like it allows us to love other people maybe more deeply or more connectedly, is that a word?
Mm. We'll make it a
But
word.
you know what I mean, we'll make it a word.
I mean, I know in my own life, if I'm in a relationship with someone, whether it be a family member, a friend, really anyone, if I am in relationship with them and a boundary is not in place and I'm feeling resentful, I'm feeling frustrated, I'm feeling like they're overstepping, I'm not able to be as present in the relationship.
Mm.
I'm not able to connect with them in the way that I want to. So I know for me, like, when that boundary is not in place, but there needs to be a boundary in place, yeah, I'm full of resentment, full of frustration.
Mhm.
There's tension there.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, when there's a boundary in place and we're both sort of respecting said boundary, all of that kind of dissolves or washes away and makes so much more space and room for, yeah, presence, connection,
Mhm.
curiosity.
Yeah, and then if we flip it around for you or us being able to love ourselves maybe more deeply, having the boundary, what's in that space that feels so important.
When I first started learning about boundaries and practicing the application of boundaries, I think that sort of self-love piece was my focus. Like, when I set a
Mhm.
boundary, this is a form of self-care, this is a form of self-love, this
Mhm.
is me honoring my own needs, my own wishes, my own desires. It's a form of showing up for ourselves that we don't really often get to do in many other ways. Like it's
Mm.
reaffirming for ourselves, like this is a need that I have and I have every right to have it. And so when we don't just say that to ourselves, when we actually send that message out into the world in whatever way through a boundary, we're reaffirming that for ourselves. I am
Mhm.
worthy of having my needs and wants and expectations heard and met. So yeah, that's sort of that piece of Prentice's quote or definition of boundaries, like where I can love you and me simultaneously. My initial understanding of boundaries was very much like the me.
Uh-huh.
Um, but I'm starting to really integrate the both. It's both you and me. This
Yeah.
boundary is for both you and me and our
Hmm.
relationship.
Hmm. I love that. And I'm also thinking of how it challenges the difference between selfishness and self-care, right? Like, is it really selfish to set boundaries and to really focus and worry about your own needs? Or is it really just you taking care of yourself in a deeper, maybe more connected way?
Yeah, I think that I imagine that's one of the harder parts about setting boundaries for a lot of people, feeling like this is a selfish act. I'm not considering the other person in this equation. I'm being all about me, me, me. Yeah, it really brings up that difference of like selfishness versus self care.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, honoring our needs is a form of self care.
How do you feel like you know when a boundary needs to be set? Like, what are some things to maybe look out for or acknowledge internally?
Yeah, the feeling of like agitation in the body. Like when
Uh-huh.
I'm in relationship with someone and there's just a sense of agitation, there's a sense of maybe I'm feeling drained after
Mm,
a conversation or being with a person, the resentment, as I had mentioned
mm.
earlier, like if I'm
Yeah.
starting to feel resentful about a relationship, a person, a thing in my life, perhaps there's a need for a boundary to be set. Perhaps there's a
Mhm.
need for more space between me and that thing, me and that person. Those are typically my signs. I don't know if there's any others that come to mind for you. Yeah, mine are like the agitation, the resentment,
Mhm.
feeling super drained.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm with you on those. I'm thinking of those internal signs. No, like, no, that's not okay.
And bringing another person into the conversation, like Brene Brown talks about
Mhm.
boundaries a lot too, another researcher, social worker, and says like boundaries are very simply like what's okay and what's not okay.
Mhm.
And what I
Mhm.
heard you saying was just
Mhm.
like that internal, this is not okay.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Like you being in my space in this way, physically or energetically,
Ah.
emotionally, is not okay.
Mhm.
And so maybe that does manifest in that sort of ick.
Yeah, and even like time, right? I'm thinking about all the different types of boundaries of like boundaries around time and boundaries around personal space, boundaries around emotions, belongings, and there's all of these different places we can set boundaries to be more protective of ourselves, allowing us to show up differently in relationship with people and things, right? And I'm sure the need to set boundaries would be different in all of those different realms of things, personal space
Mm.
or items or time or energy or emotion or whatever it is.
Yeah, it can be really, I think, easy to just think about boundary setting in sort of one sense of the word of like, okay, someone is like maybe like physically too close to me, or they're not giving me enough
Mhm.
space in the house, or their stuff is all over my side of the room, like whatever it is.
Mhm.
And to remember there are ways in which we need to set boundaries in many parts of our lives.
Yeah.
I think emotionally is one that I've like the category of like emotional boundaries is one that I've struggled with
Mhm.
the most because it feels really ambiguous
Yeah.
and amorphous. Like it's like what exactly is going on here emotionally in this relationship that's giving me that ick, that's making me feel drained and restless and agitated and resentful. It's hard to, for me at least, it's really hard to get clear on what is the boundary I need to set in
Mhm.
this sort of emotional exchange.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you were saying that, I was thinking for me, part of what's hard is what's at risk. What could be at risk, at least in my brain, like the narrative in my brain is saying, or a part of me is saying, like, maybe don't set the boundary because if you do, then what will they think? What will they do? How will this impact future interactions? It can go and go and go and go. So it can feel so scary to do that because it feels different, it feels risky, it feels vulnerable. And if maybe you haven't been comfortable like being in those places and feeling those things, it can feel just like really flooding to even consider setting a boundary.
Yeah, I was thinking about who might struggle with boundaries the most, and people or types of people came to mind. And I was
Mm-hmm.
thinking like the people pleasers, the
Mm-hmm.
perfectionists,
Mm-hmm.
those of us, and I say us because I wholeheartedly identify with perfectionism and people
Love it.
pleasing.
Lovingly a part of your crew.
Right, right. I feel like those sort of parts of me make it really hard to set boundaries because we don't, like you
Mm-hmm.
were just saying, like we don't, the fear is like what will this person think? How will this make them feel? Are
Mm-hmm.
they going to leave? Go so deep down to like am I then lovable, right? Like am I
Will I
worthy
ever
of love in this
belong?
relationship?
There's lots of scary things, like scary and very real things that are underneath all of this.
Yeah, which is why I think like, the physical category of boundary setting, there's some things that are maybe more concrete of like time, for example. I need to set a boundary around the time that I'm spending doing XYZ with this person, what have you. And then there will be for other categories that are really challenging for people to
Mhm.
set boundaries in because of those tendencies, the people pleasing, the perfectionism.
Absolutely. It's so funny because when you're talking about even just like physically setting a boundary, I'm thinking of when I was growing up. I have a twin sister and we shared a room forever for our entire lives. And we are just like complete opposites. And growing up, I used to get duct tape and literally draw a line down the center of the room. So, like a very physical boundary. And like my side of the room was very type A, right? Like very like organized and put away. You can envision that. And then my sister's side of the room was just like shit was like everywhere, everywhere. So it was just this like very physical boundary of like, no, your shit stays on your side and my side
Mm.
stays the way that I need it to stay. That felt really easy, probably because it was like such a safe relationship and we were literally going to live together for 18 years of our lives in the same room. So yeah, I think that was probably like my first time setting very physical boundary.
I love that. And I wonder too, like, even like an inch of clothing over that line. Nope, not
Nope, nope, like
okay.
thrown across the room. Like, what are you thinking? Like, get it off my side.
Oh, that's awesome. That is
Uh-huh.
awesome. Yeah. I mean, like what you said in there too was like that was such a safe relationship for you
Mm-hmm.
to set that really concrete boundary. And
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about who we have an easier time setting boundaries with versus who in our lives it's much harder to set boundaries with. In that
Mm-hmm.
relationship, it's like, all right, we're going to be doing this for a long time.
We're in this for the long haul. Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel really comfortable and safe with you. Like, just putting that line
Mm-hmm.
down. And then there's
Mm-hmm.
other people in our lives where like, the boundary setting is not only harder, but it's going to like look and sound very different. I often think about, and I think people have like different words for this, but for me, it resonates most to think about like internal and external boundaries. Like, I do feel like
Mm.
there are some people in our lives where like external boundary setting, explicit verbal boundary setting, or explicit like tape on the floor boundary setting may not be super safe or possible. And so, like, what does
Mm-hmm.
then boundary setting
Yeah.
look like in those relationships? Does it have to be a little bit more internal initially, where we're kind of, I'm thinking about diet culture and how it's so pervasive, and we hear conversations about bodies and food left and right. Once you see it,
Mm-hmm.
you can't unsee it. And so, like, I know for me, there's certain people in my life where I feel way more comfortable and safe to say, look, I'm not about that. That
Mm-hmm.
sort of topic is not okay for me. Let's
Yeah.
talk about something else, like being really explicit,
Mm-hmm.
unapologetically so. And then there's other people, whether it's just like distant relation, I'm not as close with them. So it's kind of like, I don't really know how this is going to land, where the
Mm-hmm.
boundary may be that I, instead of saying something explicitly, I need to sort of maybe step out of the room
Yeah.
or change the subject or be a little bit more internal, like do more of the internal work as a boundary
Mm-hmm.
setting. Yeah, I don't know how I went from sort of tape on the floor to that,
Uh-huh.
but
No,
thinking about
no,
the
you
types of people in our lives we have
uh-huh.
to
No,
set boundaries with.
absolutely. Yeah. And even those people that feel I'm doing air quotes. I don't know why I'm doing it. Maybe it will make sense when I keep talking, but that feel really safe to set boundaries and then they don't honor the boundary.
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
know, so it's like, oh, I have safety here. I can share like this. Please don't talk about food or your diet or whatever it is. And they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I hear you. I hear you. And then they do anyway. That
Mm-hmm.
can feel really, really hard because you thought that they were safe and maybe they aren't as safe as you hoped they were or they were before or whatever it is.
It's so hard. Yeah. There's really like no formula or step by step approach of like, okay, I set the boundary, they follow it, they meet it, and then we move on in our
Mm-hmm.
relationship and everything is peachy. It's
Uh-huh.
like setting the boundary in a way that feels aligned for us and for the relationship. I mean, that's happened so many times where a boundary's been set and someone hasn't met it, especially as it relates to conversations around food,
Mm-hmm.
diet culture talk,
Mm-hmm.
body talk.
Yep.
And my guess in that is like it's so like as I had said before, it's so pervasive, it's so ingrained. There is a compassionate part of me that's like comes up and recognizes
Mm-hmm.
and remembers this is hard for a lot of people to even recognize in themselves, maybe like, oh yeah, I'm talking about that diet again. I don't,
Mm-hmm.
they may not necessarily realize, even though you have set the boundary,
Yeah.
there may be a forgetfulness there, like
Mm-hmm.
an unawareness. And so the
Mm-hmm.
conversation keeps going. So there is like that aspect of me that comes up of like, okay, can I maybe be compassionate? And
Mm-hmm.
also, I'm pissed, I'm angry, you know, I had an expectation that did not get met.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, like what I know I sort of try to do next is it is really fluid. Like, can I reset the boundary? Can I speak up about that again? Can I remind the
Mm-hmm.
person, hey, again, this is something that really I don't want to talk about and see what happens. And if that boundary continues to not be met, then the question becomes, okay, now what do I need to do to adjust?
And I think that can look lots of ways, right? That can, in maybe more extreme or more intense cases, that means sometimes like ending the relationship, you know, or creating
Mm,
more space from that relationship, maybe. And other times, I think it can mean other things, like maybe just spending less time or just shutting down talk right away, or like you said earlier,
mm,
walking out of a room. The span of all of that can be pretty vast if someone
mm.
continues to cross the boundary, cross the boundary, cross the boundary.
Yeah. And as I said earlier, I feel like boundary setting is there's no sort of linear path, there's no
Mm-hmm.
formula. It's kind of trial and error. If it feels safe to do so at the front end, when you set the boundary, if it feels safe to say, being really concise and clear, like, I need, I want, I expect blank from you. And if that doesn't happen, or, you know, I need us to not talk about these things when we're together. And if that doesn't happen, like, this is what I'll need to do. Kind of
Mm-hmm.
like setting it all out at the forefront if that feels comfortable can
Mm-hmm.
be helpful. And maybe not initially, like maybe that's not required or necessary, but perhaps in that resetting of the boundary it's like, hey, we talked about
Mm-hmm.
this, I really love hanging out, I want to keep doing that. And when we start talking about diets and food and all of this stuff, as I had mentioned before, I feel blank,
Mm-hmm.
or it's a lot for me. I need us to
Yeah,
not talk about that. And if we continue to find ourselves in this place, I need to maybe create some more distance, whatever it is, fill in the blank
whatever it
for what
is.
makes sense for you in the
Mm-hmm.
relationship.
Absolutely. And you know, body talk too, body comments, I think is something that we talk a lot about of not only diet talk and food talk, but also when people just like so freely comment on bodies and just like stop, right? Generally, like everyone's
Mm-hmm.
just stop. But when people are communicating that, it's I think it becomes almost so second nature for people to talk about bodies and hate on their bodies and talk about that, right? That they don't even realize it half the time, which
Yeah.
again, like a corner of compassion of like, yeah, we get it, you know, diet culture is real and we live in a really shitty society. And there's suffering that's happening on the other side of these types of body comments and like pulling people back into really really hard patterns and behaviors and self-beliefs. There's like a lot of risk in making those comments.
Mm-hmm. I feel like it's as common as like talking about the weather in many ways. It's
Yeah.
so automatic. And I do feel as though there are many people that are just not aware
Mm-hmm.
that they're maybe even talking about it again, or that it has the impact that it has.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's everywhere. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm just thinking about, again, sort of like my menu of options. Not that I have the
Mm-hmm.
menu readily available in my brain all the time. Like sometimes it's hard to think about, what do I want to say? What do I want to do in these moments? Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
we freeze, and like that's okay too. It's hard to know what to do, but sometimes like my menu of options does pop up, and the menu is
I
like,
love that.
can I change the subject? Oh,
Mm-hmm.
speaking of, I don't know, speaking of
Shorts.
pants,
I
like,
know.
have you gone?
Like what? Yeah.
Speaking of like pants, have you gone to that new mall or whatever?
Uh-huh.
However, it makes sense. Like, I do find that to be sort of my most used menu item. If it's
Mm-hmm.
too hard to set a really firm boundary in that moment, or it doesn't make sense in the situation or with the person, perhaps
Mm-hmm.
the best boundary to set is, okay, we're going to change the subject now.
Yeah.
But the other menu options or items are really like, leaving the space, leaving
Mm-hmm.
the room if that's what you
Mm-hmm.
need to do. And of course, like setting a more explicit boundary when you talk about bodies. And it doesn't have to be some long convoluted thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
I need us to not talk about bodies or
Bodies.
diets or whatever, point blank.
Yeah. Point blank, done. That's just what I need.
Mm-hmm.
Because it can feel so overwhelming to consider. Okay, how do I feel? How do I communicate that? What do I need? How am I going to handle it? Right. And going straight to the point of, I just can't be around when you're talking about bodies. Like, I just need you to not do it. And
Mm-hmm.
trusting that whatever fallout happens, if fallout happens, you're going to be able to handle that. And hopefully the relationship will
Mm-hmm.
be able to handle that.
Some affirmations I think that are helpful when setting boundaries is, I mean, I know for me is sort of, however this boundary lands for this person is for them to process
Mm-hmm.
and figure out and take care of. I also think a lot about like, that's theirs, this is mine. Yeah, it's really, really complex. I mean, I've also heard before some people talk about, or like use sort of an analogy of when setting boundaries around this sort of diet
Mm-hmm.
talk, body talk, which I think can be helpful for some people and maybe
Mm-hmm.
solidify it more in their brains, which is, how some people don't like to talk about religion or politics. Like, somehow some people just kind of keep that out of conversation. That's how I feel about diet talk and body talk. I want for us to kind of keep that off the table moving
Mm-hmm.
forward. I haven't used that one in particular, but I think it could be helpful for some.
So let's go back real quick to some of like the internal work around boundaries. So we talked a lot about the external work and the how and all of that. And what about what you can do internally with yourself while or after setting a boundary?
I After I set a boundary, I find it really helpful to kind of check in with myself. How did that feel when I set the boundary? Like in that moment, how did I feel physically in my body? If I can sort of tap into that, what were some of the thoughts that were sort of running through my mind? How did that land for the other person? And again, that is not our responsibility, but just like noticing
Mm-hmm.
what came up for the other person, and therefore what reaction did that stir up in me. Just taking a moment to pause and reflect, what was that interaction like? And then
Mm-hmm.
sort of after the fact, how am I feeling now that the boundary is set? How am I feeling again in my body? What are some things I'm thinking about? Did that boundary feel aligned? And it may be unclear, we may not know right away. I just think taking a moment to check in, and then also remembering and reminding ourselves, a boundary is not
Mm-hmm.
finite, it's not final. Like, you can have a do-over, you can go back and adjust course. Sometimes I've set boundaries that are way too rigid,
Mm-hmm.
more rigid than I had intended,
Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't actually what I wanted or needed, and that's okay. I set a really rigid boundary that felt right and made sense in the moment, and then thereafter, after checking in with myself again, how is this boundary feeling for me? Noticing, okay, perhaps I don't need it to be this rigid. There's the metaphor, like the visual of like a brick wall as a
Mm-hmm.
boundary that's super rigid. Can I then maybe sort of backtrack and get curious about what might like sort of a garden fence boundary look
Mm-hmm.
like? One that has a gate
Yeah.
that opens and closes, that's a little bit more permeable or flexible. And then, of
Mhm.
course, going back to that person or whoever you set the boundary with to continue the communication. I
Mhm.
set this boundary. It's not feeling super right for me anymore. And you don't even have to use the word boundary. However, you
Mhm.
communicate that.
This
We
like
had this
limit or whatever. Yeah.
conversation. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
I said I needed this space in this way. And after taking some time to reflect on it and think about it, I'm realizing that may not actually be what I need. And what I'm really hoping for, what I really want is for the relationship to look this way. I find that to be super helpful. Checking in with myself. How did that feel in the moment? How does it feel now? And intermittently checking in with yourself. How is this still feeling? Do I need to
Mhm.
change the boundary? Because that's
Mhm.
completely allowed.
Absolutely. And there that is again, that like taking care of yourself and taking care of the relationship, right? That
Mm,
that boundary does that and it really honors that process of being able to show up in that way for yourself and in the relationship that you're in. And I'm also just thinking of practice, right? It it can be really hard. I have a hard time with boundaries a lot at times. It's a lot of my own personal work. And so it's like this practice and practice and practice and practice that makes it a bit more of a skill at some point, maybe
mm.
still challenging, but it's okay if it's not easy at first.
Yeah, similar to the sort of post check in after setting a
Uh-huh.
boundary. We can do any kind of post check in if we didn't set a boundary and we really
Mhm.
needed to or wished we had. It can be easy to get down on ourselves. I should have spoken up in that moment. I should have
Mm.
said something, should have done something differently. And sure, we can honor that, recognize a boundary would have been helpful in that moment. I did the best that I could with what I had. And
Mhm.
next time, if there's the opportunity, and also I can, reach out to this person. Like there are
Mhm.
options for moving forward. There's still potential to set boundaries, whether they are internal boundaries or external boundaries.
Love that. Yes.
Mm.
Anything else you feel like you want to add?
Yeah, boundary setting is so hard, and it's just a constant conversation with ourselves. What do we need? What do we want? We are worthy and deserving of having our needs be known
Mm.
by others in our lives.
Mhm.
It can be really helpful to just consistently check in with yourself, whether it's through a journal practice, through therapy, to just get more in touch with what are my needs, what are my wants, are they being met by myself and by others? And if not, what are some ways I can take care of that? What are some ways I can communicate that?
Beautiful. I love it. All right, everybody. We will be back next week for another episode. And in the meantime, make sure you head to the website and check out all of our new merch that we just launched last week. And let us know what your thoughts are around boundaries, what's challenging, what's helpful, even celebrating success in setting boundaries, because I think that's important too. Let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear. All right. We will see you next week.